The cameras were rolling, the studio lights hot, every word echoing across the airwaves to millions of viewers. It was supposed to be a debate about policy, a conversation on vision and leadership. But Kari Lake didn't come to talk about policy. She came to land a blow. With the smirk of a seasoned provocateur, she leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. She should spend less time worrying about politics, Lake sneered, her eyes narrowing toward Jasmine Crockett, and more time worrying about how she looks on television. The words dropped like a stone in water, sending ripples of gasps across the audience. A momentary silence followed, the kind of silence that isn't empty but charged, heavy, alive with disbelief. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to linger on Crockett's face or capture the smug grin playing at the corners of Lake's mouth. It was the oldest trick in the book: reduce a woman to her appearance, belittle her credibility, with a shallow jab, and hope the sting would distract from substance. Kari Lake knew exactly what she was doing. She thrived in chaos, thrived on shock, thrived on the cheap applause of those who mistake cruelty for strength. But this time, something was different. The insult wasn't just an attack on Jasmine Crockett. It was an attack on every woman who had ever been told to smile more, every immigrant's daughter who had been told she didn't look the part, every voice dismissed because of the face that carried it. You could see the studio audience recoil, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others widening their eyes in stunned disbelief. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, shared, and captioned with outrage. Within seconds, hashtags began forming, digital bonfires sparking in real time. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat still, composed, her eyes fixed on Kari Lake with a calm intensity. Not a flinch, not a crack. Her silence was louder than the insult itself. The air grew thicker, the tension unbearable. Every viewer, every pundit, every opponent leaned in, waiting to see what would happen next. But no one in the studio was prepared for how Crockett would respond. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to see the battlefield it unfolded on. Kari Lake didn't arrive at that studio as just another debater. She came armed with her reputation, sharp-tongued, media-savvy. A former TV anchor who reinvented herself as a firebrand, willing to say anything, no matter how ugly, to rile a crowd. Her strategy was simple: dominate with noise, humiliate with spectacle, and never let substance interrupt the show. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, walked in carrying a very different weight. A first-term Congresswoman, a lawyer by training, she was not a polished media star, but a fighter shaped by the grit of courtroom battles and community struggles. For her, the debate was not about headlines. It was about representing the people who had entrusted her with their voice, the overlooked, the working class, the marginalized. She came prepared with arguments, facts, and clarity. But she didn't come prepared for the moment her opponent would aim below the belt. And that was exactly what made Kari Lake's insult so explosive. Because it wasn't just petty. It was tactical. It was meant to unbalance Crockett, to bait her into anger, to turn her intellect into silence. Kari Lake's supporters had seen this play before: mock the opponent, then gloat when they stumble. But Crockett's supporters, both in the studio and watching from their living rooms, felt the cut in their bones. The stakes had suddenly skyrocketed. This was no longer about the nuances of policy or party platforms. This was about dignity itself. Would Crockett take the bait and lose her composure, validating every stereotype Kari Lake wanted to reinforce? Or would she hold steady, and in doing so, prove that insults crumble in the presence of true resolve? You could almost hear the audience divide. On one side, muted chuckles from Lake's base, those who loved seeing political correctness destroyed in real time. On the other, gasps of outrage, a collective sense of, did she really just say that? A national audience now hung on every breath, sensing they were no longer watching a debate but a defining confrontation. And in that moment, something deeper stirred. Viewers who had been dismissed for their accents, their hairstyles, their clothing choices, saw themselves in Crockett's silence. People who had been told they didn't look professional enough or American enough felt the weight of the insult as if it had been hurled at them. The debate had cracked open into something larger, a struggle over who gets to define worthiness in American public life. The moderators shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't in their notes. This wasn't the script they had prepared for. The cameras caught every beat of tension, every twitch in the room. Crockett's silence had stretched into something unbearable. Not weakness, but suspense, an unspoken declaration that her response would come when she was ready, and not a second before. And then came the whispers. What would she say? How would she fire back? Would this be the moment Kari Lake finally went too far, or the moment Crockett was steamrolled like so many others who had underestimated Lake's ruthlessness? Millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, their hearts pounding with the drama of it all. They didn't just want an answer, they needed it. And yet, what she said next would ignite a storm far bigger than anyone expected. To understand the venom in Kari Lake's insult, you have to know who Kari Lake is and how she became the kind of figure who treats cruelty as currency. Once upon a time, she was a household face for entirely different reasons. As a TV anchor in Arizona, she smiled into living rooms for decades, delivering the evening news with polished hair, precise diction, and the warm confidence of someone trained to embody trust. Viewers invited her into their homes night after night, never suspecting that behind the camera, she was quietly building an appetite for something larger: power. When she traded in the anchor desk for a podium, Lake didn't come gently into politics. She came crashing in, cloaked in the fire of grievance. She declared herself the voice of the real people, railing against the media she had once been part of, scorning institutions she had once served, and casting herself as a fearless warrior who would say the unsayable. And in that transformation, her sharp edges, once sanded down for broadcast professionalism, were allowed to gleam in full. It wasn't enough for her to debate opponents. She had to belittle them. It wasn't enough to argue policy. She had to reduce her rivals to caricatures. She thrived on insult politics, on the spectacle of verbal takedowns. Audiences that adored her didn't necessarily admire her solutions. They admired her combativeness. They wanted someone who fought dirty, someone who made the other side squirm, and Kari Lake gave them exactly that. Over time, a pattern emerged. A rival candidate was weak. A journalist was ugly or biased. A voter who asked a tough question was a plant. She rarely engaged with substance because spectacle served her better. The more outrageous her barbs, the more viral her clips became. Cable shows replayed them. Podcasts amplified them. She had discovered the modern equation of politics. Cruelty equals attention, and attention equals power. But there's a cost to a strategy like that. When everything becomes a performance, the line between strength and arrogance begins to blur. What some saw as boldness, others saw as a dangerous contempt, not just for her opponents, but for the very idea of civil discourse. Each insult may have won her applause in the moment, but each also etched her deeper into a role she could no longer escape, the antagonist who thrived on tearing others down. And so, when she sat across from Jasmine Crockett that night, Lake was not improvising. She was playing a part she had rehearsed 100 times before. To her, reducing Crockett to how she looks on television was not a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate move. The next act in a long-running performance where women who dared to challenge her were first trivialized, then dismissed. But this time something shifted. Because this time, she underestimated the woman in the chair across from her. Jasmine Crockett was not just another opponent on Kari Lake's checklist. She was a lawyer who had dismantled arrogant men in courtrooms. She was a congresswoman who had faced the vitriol of politics and learned to stand taller under fire. She was, in essence, everything Lake's insult was designed to deny: capable, dignified, unshaken. That's why the insult didn't just sting, it exposed Lake. For the first time, the nation wasn't merely laughing with her at some outlandish put-down. They were gasping at the audacity. They saw not a fighter, but a bully. Not strength, but desperation. And yet, Kari Lake sat back in her chair, still smiling, certain that she had landed the blow. In her mind, Crockett was about to unravel, about to stumble into the trap that had snared so many before her. But arrogance is a dangerous blindfold, because the arrogance that carried her this far was about to meet its match. To see the full force of Jasmine Crockett's composure in that studio, you have to step back and understand the woman behind the silence. Her story didn't begin under bright lights or in front of cameras. It began in the courtrooms of Texas long before most of America even knew her name. Jasmine Crockett grew up with grit. She was no stranger to being underestimated, no stranger to being told that her voice was too loud, her ambition too sharp, her presence too disruptive. But every time the world tried to shrink her, she refused to fold. She studied hard, earned her law degree, and walked into a legal system where too often the scales were tipped against the vulnerable. And instead of simply practicing law, she wielded it as a weapon for justice. Her specialty: defending the marginalized, the overlooked, the people without powerful friends or political donations. In courtroom after courtroom, she faced down prosecutors, police officers, and entrenched systems that treated poor defendants like afterthoughts. She wasn't afraid to rattle cages, wasn't afraid to call out injustice even when the judges scowled and the opposition sneered. Every case sharpened her. Every confrontation taught her the art of standing firm in the face of arrogance. And that's what made her so different from Kari Lake. Where Lake's career was built on appearances and applause, Crockett's was built on sweat, study, and sacrifice. Where Lake's power came from dominating a screen, Crockett's came from defending people whose lives hung in the balance. One woman learned to deliver zingers on television. The other learned to stand her ground when entire systems tried to silence her. When Crockett ran for Congress, she carried those same qualities into politics. She wasn't born into a dynasty, wasn't backed by billionaire donors. She was propelled by communities who saw in her someone unafraid to speak when others were too timid. In committee hearings, she developed a reputation for being fierce, unflinching, and unapologetically direct. Clips of her challenging colleagues, sometimes with sharp wit, sometimes with volcanic frustration, circulated widely online. To her supporters, she wasn't just a representative. She was a mirror of their own struggles, their own voices finally echoing in the halls of power. That's why the insult from Kari Lake landed with such weight. For Crockett, it was hardly the first time someone had tried to reduce her to appearance. In law school, professors had dismissed her sharpness. In campaigns, opponents had mocked her style. In Congress, critics on social media had thrown the ugliest words at her image. Each time, she had learned to let the words roll off while sharpening her focus. Each time, she had transformed the attempt to belittle her into fuel for something greater. So when she sat in that studio, staring down Kari Lake, she was not a rookie stumbling into hostile fire. She was a veteran of battles that had prepared her for this exact moment. Her calm wasn't the silence of someone stunned. It was the patience of someone who knows that dignity, when wielded correctly, is more powerful than any insult. And here's the irony. The very traits Lake thought she was attacking Crockett's presence, her confidence, her ability to own the stage, were the same traits that made her untouchable. Lake saw appearance. The audience saw poise. Lake saw weakness. The audience saw restraint. As Crockett sat there, still and composed, viewers watching at home were reminded of their own journeys. The immigrant worker who had been told his accent made him unworthy. The young woman who had been passed over in a meeting because of how she looked. The community that had been told for generations that it didn't belong. Crockett's silence became more than her own. It became theirs. This was the culmination of everything Jasmine Crockett had lived for. Every courtroom battle, every campaign rally, every hearing in Congress had prepared her to face this kind of arrogance with unshakable dignity. Kari Lake thought she had cornered her opponent. But what she had really done was step into a story larger than herself, a story that had been building long before the cameras turned on. And in that moment, Crockett's supporters, both in the studio and across the country, felt a collective anticipation. They knew this wasn't the end of the exchange. It was the calm before the eruption, the poised inhale before the thunderclap. The silence before a response so sharp, so undeniable, that it would pierce through the arrogance on the other side of the table. The studio lights seemed to burn brighter. The audience sat on the edge of their seats. Kari Lake leaned back, smug, and unaware of the tide about to turn. And Jasmine Crockett, steady and unflinching, prepared to speak with the full weight of her journey behind her. And in this moment, every part of her journey led to one defining response. The studio had become a pressure cooker. Kari Lake, still grinning at her own line, mistook the silence for victory. She leaned forward again, sensing an opening, her words dripping with that same smug certainty that had carried her through rallies and interviews. See, this is what happens when people who don't belong in leadership try to play dress-up. They look the part, maybe, for a second, but you scratch the surface and there's nothing there. Gasps rippled through the crowd again, sharper this time, no longer mixed with laughter. Moderators shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward Crockett, waiting for a break in the tension, some release from the escalating hostility. But Crockett didn't flinch. She sat with the same composure, the same unshaken gaze, her silence now more commanding than Lake's words. Lake doubled down, as bullies so often do when they sense resistance. I'm here to talk about the real issues. But clearly, some people are here just to be seen. Her hand flicked dismissively in Crockett's direction. It was meant to degrade, to erase. It was meant to tell every viewer watching at home that Crockett was a prop, not a participant. But here's the thing about arrogance. The more it spreads, the more it exposes itself. For every cheer Lake imagined she was earning, there were countless viewers who saw the condescension for what it was. They recognized the tactic. They'd seen it at work, in classrooms, in offices, in politics for generations. When a powerful woman of color dares to stand tall, the quickest attack is to tear down her appearance, her legitimacy, her right to even be in the room. The studio itself became a character in the drama. Some in the audience sat rigid, their outrage barely contained. Others looked on with narrowed eyes, already filming reactions on their phones, ready to send the moment spiraling across social media. Even the moderators, typically trained to remain neutral, betrayed flashes of discomfort. They knew this was no longer a debate about policy, it was a test of dignity. And through it all, Crockett's silence stretched, not awkward, but deliberate. It wasn't the silence of being caught off guard. It was the silence of calculation. Every heartbeat in that room ticked louder, every second dragged heavier. Her stillness became suspense, and the longer she waited, the more powerful the eventual release would be. Viewers at home leaned forward. Would she finally snap? Would she trade insult for insult? Would she strike back in kind, or would she let Lake's words hang there, poisoning the air unchecked? Lake smirked again, as if mistaking silence for surrender. She clasped her hands, satisfied. That's what I thought, she said, almost whispering, her tone dripping with patronizing triumph. And that was when the shift became undeniable. You could feel it, like the moment before thunder splits the sky. Crockett's stillness was not surrender. It was preparation. Her calm wasn't retreat. It was strength building, gathering, waiting for the precise moment to strike with the kind of response that doesn't just answer an insult, but dismantles it entirely. The audience could sense it too. Phones rose higher, eyes grew wider, breaths caught in throats. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The tension was no longer about whether Crockett would respond. It was about how. And then, with the world watching, she unleashed the response that no one saw coming. When Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, the atmosphere in the studio shifted like a thunderhead breaking. Her hands rested calmly on the desk, her voice measured, low, but carrying a weight that sliced through the noise. You know, she began, eyes never leaving Kari Lake's. It's fascinating to me how someone who spent decades reading words off a teleprompter thinks she has the authority to reduce another woman to nothing more than her looks. The audience erupted, not in cheers just yet, but in the kind of audible gasp that comes when the air is suddenly electrified. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't lashed out. But her words landed with surgical precision, and for the fade. First time that evening, Lake's smirk faltered. Crockett pressed on, her cadence steady, each word deliberate. You built a career on appearances. Perfect hair, polished smile, camera angles. You packaged yourself like a product and sold that product as credibility. And maybe that worked. On the evening news, when you could hide behind a script someone else wrote for you. But this? She gestured around the room. The lights, the audience, the cameras. This is reality. And in reality, you don't get to insult women into silence. Not me. Not anyone. The crowd stirred, murmurs swelling into applause. Even the moderators leaned in, sensing that something seismic was happening. Lake shifted in her seat, visibly rattled, her usual armor of smug confidence suddenly looking fragile. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but Crockett didn't give her the chance. You see, I didn't come here tonight to play dress-up, as you so dismissively suggested. I came here representing people who don't get the luxury of being judged on their looks. I came here for working mothers who are fighting to keep food on the table. For immigrants who are told every day that their accents, their clothes, their skin disqualify them from belonging. For young girls who are taught by people like you that their value starts and ends with how pleasing they are to the eye. Her voice rose now, not in anger but in resonance, carrying beyond the stage, beyond the cameras, into living rooms across America. And I need those people to see that when you try to reduce me, you fail. Because I am more than my appearance. I am more than your insult. I am the product of sacrifice, of struggle, of service. And that, unlike a smile for the camera, cannot be manufactured. The studio erupted into thunderous applause. People rising from their seats, clapping, shouting, some even whistling. It wasn't just support. It was release. The insult that had hung heavy in the air only moments before had been shattered, flipped on its head, transformed into a weapon of truth. Kari Lake tried to interject, her voice cutting in. Oh, here we go, the victim card. But the words drowned under the roar of the crowd. Camera zoomed in on her face, her composure slipping, eyes darting, fingers tapping nervously on the desk. For once, she wasn't in control of the spectacle. She was the spectacle. Crockett didn't need to shout over her. She simply waited, the calm returning to her posture, and when the noise settled, she delivered the final blow with quiet authority. You can keep trying to make this about appearances, Kari, but history will remember character. And when people look back at this moment, they won't remember your insult. They'll remember how little it mattered. It was a mic drop without theatrics, powerful precisely because of its restraint. Crockett didn't gloat, didn't need to. She let her words hang heavy and undeniable while Lake sat beside her, visibly diminished. And the ripple effects were immediate. Phones lit up across the studio as audience members clipped the exchange in real time. Twitter feeds exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett clap back and hashtag dignity over cruelty began trending within minutes. Memes surfaced, splicing Lake's smirk before and after the takedown, captioned with phrases like, from smug to shook in 30 seconds. Commentators on rival networks, usually quick to downplay Crockett, couldn't deny what they'd witnessed. That, one analyst said breathlessly, was the kind of moment you can't script. It was raw, it was real, and it flipped the entire narrative on its head. Even celebrities chimed in, reposting the clip with words like Queen Energy and this is what leadership looks like. But perhaps the most telling reaction wasn't in the cheers or the trending hashtags. It was in Kari Lake's silence. For the remainder of the segment, she tried to recover, tried to steer the conversation back toward safe talking points, but the damage was done. The audience wasn't listening to her anymore. They were replaying Crockett's words in their minds, savoring the rare thrill of seeing arrogance collapse in real time. Back in the studio, as the applause ebbed and the moderators attempted to restore order, one truth was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had won the moment, not with anger, not with insult, but with the unshakable dignity of someone who had faced down far greater adversaries than Kari Lake and emerged stronger. Her rebuttal wasn't just an answer to one insult. It was an answer to a lifetime of dismissals. It was a statement that went beyond her own career, reaching into the lives of viewers who had felt the sting of belittlement themselves. She had spoken for them, through them, as them. And Kari Lake, the seasoned performer, the self-styled warrior of words, was left exposed. Her weapon had backfired. Her insult had built the stage for her opponent's triumph. The studio's air was thick with the weight of it, a collective awareness that something extraordinary had just unfolded. Yet as the crowd settled, as cameras continued to capture every angle of the stunned antagonist and the unflinching hero, one question lingered. If Crockett's response had detonated inside the studio, what would happen once its shockwaves reached the world outside? But the ripple effects didn't stop in the studio. The clip didn't just stay in the studio, it exploded across the country. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop response, social media was ablaze. Twitter feeds, Instagram reels, TikTok loops, every platform became a stage replaying the moment over and over again. The insult that Kari Lake had thought would define the night was buried under a tidal wave of Crockett's rebuttal. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag dignity over cruelty. Hashtag she owned the stage. The video spread not just as news, but as cultural currency. People weren't just watching it. They were sharing it as a statement of identity, as proof of what it looks like when arrogance finally meets its match. On TikTok, young women stitched Crockett's line, "History will remember character," into their own videos, pairing it with montages of trailblazing women in politics, activism, and art. On Twitter, political commentators who usually dismissed her were forced to acknowledge what had happened. This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a cultural reset. Memes of Lake's smirk melting into unease flooded Instagram, each one sharper than the last. And then came the endorsements. Celebrities reposted the clip with captions like, "This is how you do it," and Crockett 1, Lake 0. Activists hailed it as a teaching moment, a masterclass in turning an insult into empowerment. Even seasoned politicians, some from Crockett's own party who rarely weighed in on viral culture, tweeted praise, calling it a shining example of dignity under fire. Meanwhile, Kari Lake found herself in a strange new position. For someone who thrived on viral spectacle, she was suddenly the punchline of it. Clips of her smug dismissal played side by side with Crockett's takedown, captioned with brutal simplicity. Arrogance meets reality. Commentators began asking whether Lake had finally overplayed her hand, whether the tactic that once earned her applause had crossed the line into self-sabotage. In living rooms across America, viewers who weren't plugged into politics still caught glimpses of the clip on morning shows and late-night comedy segments. It became more than a political exchange, it became a cultural flashpoint. Parents showed it to their daughters as an example of how to respond with composure. Immigrants shared it in group chats, saying, "She spoke for us," and Crockett, "She didn't gloat." In interviews afterward, she brushed aside the personal drama and reframed the moment. "This isn't about me," she told reporters. "It's about reminding people that our worth is not defined by someone else's shallow view. It's about standing tall even when someone tries to cut you down." That humility, that refusal to revel in the insult, only amplified the resonance of her words. The reaction wasn't just about what happened in the studio, it was about what it symbolized. For years, many had felt drowned out by the loudest voices like Kari Lake's, who dominated with sound bites and sneers. Crockett's response offered proof that dignity could be louder than cruelty, that calm could overpower chaos. And as the days went on, the shockwaves continued. Late-night hosts joked about Lake's crumbling composure. Editorials praised Crockett for turning a cheap shot into a masterclass in leadership. On college campuses, students replayed the clip before debates as inspiration. For a progressive, immigrant-friendly, identity-pride audience, it was more than validation, it was vindication. What began as a single insult had spiraled into a national conversation, a referendum on how we treat women in public life, how we define strength, and how character always outlives spectacle. The viral storm was proof. Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she had changed the narrative. But Crockett wasn't finished. She understood that viral moments fade, that memes get replaced. And so, she prepared to turn this fleeting wave of attention into something lasting, something bigger than the studio, bigger than Kari Lake's insult. And yet, Crockett wasn't done. She transformed the moment into something even bigger. When Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the glare of the studio lights, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of a single victory, but the awareness of what it meant. She understood that a viral clip, no matter how powerful, was only the beginning. What mattered was the story it told, the lesson it left behind. And so, when she spoke in the days that followed, she didn't frame her response as a personal triumph. She framed it as a universal truth. "People will try to define you," she said in one interview, her voice calm, steady. "They'll try to box you in, shrink you down, make you feel like your worth is measured in surface details. But here's the truth. Real leadership, real service, has nothing to do with how you look. It has everything to do with what you stand for, how you fight for others, how you choose dignity when dignity is under attack." Her words resonated because they weren't abstract. They were lived. People who had felt invisible, who had been told they weren't enough, too dark, too different, too foreign, too female, heard in Crockett a validation of their own struggle. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for them. She reminded audiences that insults are distractions, tools used by those who have no argument, no vision. "When Kari Lake tried to reduce me to my appearance," Crockett explained, "she revealed more about herself than she ever did about me. And that's the lesson. When someone attacks you with smallness, you don't shrink. You stand taller." That message spread far beyond the studio confrontation. In schools, teachers replayed her rebuttal as an example of composure. Community leaders quoted her lines in speeches about dignity. Parents shared the clip with their children, saying, "This is how you answer hate with strength, not bitterness." And for Crockett's supporters, the moment became more than validation. It became a rallying cry, a reminder that even in an era of noise, cheap shots, and viral cruelty, there is still power in poise, still value in restraint, still glory in refusing to let arrogance win. What began as Kari Lake's insult ended as Jasmine Crockett's lesson. That dignity is not weakness, it is the ultimate form of resistance. That leadership is not about tearing others down, but about lifting truths higher. And that America, in all its diversity and contradictions, still hungers for leaders who embody that kind of strength. In the end, Crockett's response wasn't remembered as a clapback or a meme. It was remembered as a moment when someone turned cruelty into clarity. A moment when a woman facing insult didn't just defend herself, but offered a blueprint for how to rise above. And as the clip continued to circulate, as hashtags trended and pundits dissected, one sentiment echoed louder than all the rest: dignity will always outshine hate. And so, when the dust settled, the story wasn't about Kari Lake's insult. It wasn't about the cheap smirk, the shallow jab, or the fleeting moment of arrogance. The story was about Jasmine Crockett, how she stood in the fire and didn't flinch, how she turned an attempt to humiliate into a lesson in strength. In that studio, under the hottest lights, she reminded the nation that cruelty crumbles in the face of character. That's why this moment matters. Because every time someone is told they don't belong, every time appearance is used as a weapon, every time arrogance tries to drown out truth, there is an answer. And the answer isn't more hate, more noise, more cruelty. The answer is dignity. The answer is standing tall when someone else tries to cut you down. Kari Lake wanted a viral insult. Jasmine Crockett gave us something timeless. A reminder that justice speaks louder than arrogance, that courage speaks louder than mockery, that the American story is bigger than any one person's attempt to belittle it. And now the question turns to us. Do we sit back and watch, letting moments like this pass as entertainment? Or do we carry the lesson forward, sharing it, amplifying it, letting it shape how we respond when arrogance rears its head again? If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of the power of dignity, then don't let it stop here. Share this story. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Add your voice to the movement that insists character still matters, that refuses to let hate have the last word. Because as Jasmine Crockett showed us, dignity doesn't just defend, it inspires. And that is how history remembers.